As planned, early in the morning, Mrs. Khan went to knock on Tam's door, and the two of them hurriedly set off. By noon, they arrived at Trin's house. When passing through Longton City, Tam stopped to buy 2 jackfruits as gifts for Trin's younger sister. Upon reaching VNG Tau, the car pulled into Trin's yard. Mrs. Khan, feeling nervous, tapped Tam's back and whispered, "The house is so quiet like this, there probably isn't anything happening." Tam turned off the engine and replied, "I think so too. No crying, no crowd of people. It's reassuring." Mrs. Khan looked around, the gloomy atmosphere of the low-roofed house, always shaded by the old trees. She felt a little embarrassed with Tam because if nothing had happened, it was clear that her husband had bothered Trin's husband because of her vague dream. Especially Tam had to leave her own household chores and 2 young children to accompany her here. Tam stepped forward, knocked on the door, and called out, "Trin, is anyone home?" Mrs. Khan looked at the closed main door with a large lock hanging outside, regaining some composure. She whispered to Tam, "With a lock like that on the outside, it's probably that they are not at home." Tam nodded eagerly, "Yes, but I feel more relieved now. If there was something bad, the house wouldn't be this quiet." Finishing her words, Tam knocked on the door again and continued, "Mrs. Trin, Mr. H.C., is anyone home?" Naturally, there was no response. Since entering the gate, Tam had already alleviated much of her anxiety because it was clear there was no funeral taking place. She stood on the yard, looking around the garden. Mrs. Khan, on the other hand, walked along the side of the house, circling to the back. She stood by the fence, looking ahead. The low lychee tree, which Trin usually picked a full basket of delicious fruits for her every year, was in the corner of the yard. At the end of the yard, next to the wall separating it from the neighboring house, the leaning guava tree looked as if it would collapse onto the bathroom and the dilapidated wooden wall of the tin-roofed restroom, which had almost peeled off all its light green paint. Suddenly, Mrs. Khan looked up and noticed a black crow that had been perched on the sparse lychee tree all along, its eerie gaze following her every move. She quickly turned away and sighed, returning to the front yard. This area used to be a French vacation spot, with scattered houses, so the neighbors rarely saw each other. Since Mrs. Trin married Mr. H.C., almost every year she stayed with her daughter for a few days, so Mrs. Khan knew every nook and cranny of the front yard and the back garden very well. Tam walked back to her mother and asked, "Should I wait here, or should I take you for a walk along the beach and come back later?" Although Mrs. Khan had reassured herself, she still replied, "Let's wait, my dear. It's already past noon, they probably didn't go far. But if they return to Saigon, we must let me know beforehand." "Well, be patient and wait a little longer, they should be coming back soon." Tam mounted the motorbike and reminded herself, "Mom, go to sleep. Did you eat anything? I'll buy it for you. I'm going to the beach, and I'll visit Dung. Do you remember Dung? She used to be in the club with Trin. Since she got married, she has stopped working." Tam kicked the motorbike and rode onto the road. Mrs. Khan approached, grabbed the hammock and shook it vigorously to remove all the dried leaves stuck on it. Then she gently sat down. The basket containing 2 jackfruits was placed right next to her. She slowly lay down, stretched out her legs, and began to close her eyes. She thought about Mr. Ken, who was impatiently waiting at home, and how he would seize the opportunity to scold her for indulging in unrealistic dreams. After lying down for about 10 minutes, Mrs. Trin saw Trin leaning against the mango tree a few steps away, looking at her with a worried expression. Mrs. Ken joyfully exclaimed, "Trin, where have you been? Mom and Tam have been waiting for you. Did you finish your studies?" Mrs. Trin remained silent, staring at her mother, which surprised Mrs. Ken greatly. Mrs. Ken sat up, called her daughter, and said, come here to Mom. Why do you look so thin these days?" Under the shade of a large tree, Mrs. Trin's already pale skin appeared even paler. Her eyes were dark as if she had been sleep-deprived for days or had just recovered from a long illness. Mrs. Ken stood up and approached her daughter, but her clothes got tangled in the hammock and she couldn't free herself. She pulled hard, trying to step forward but couldn't. Meanwhile, Trin gradually moved backward towards the trunk of the tree and suddenly said, "Mom, I'm dead." Those words, those echoing sounds, felt as if they were reverberating from a distant, unfamiliar world, terrifying Mrs. Ken. She looked in agony as her daughter slowly walked out of the gate, crossed the road, and disappeared. She frantically chased after her, continuously calling out. It was only when she fell hard from the hammock to the ground that she woke up and realized it was just a dream. Regaining her senses, she crawled back up and sat leaning against the tree trunk. She felt sad, and tears streamed down her face. She was sitting right in front of her daughter's house, in this familiar courtyard. Why did her daughter appear when she had just fallen asleep? She reluctantly stood up, looked around in confusion, and a sudden gust of wind blew, sending a chilling sensation through her bones. Despite it being the late afternoon of a summer day, and only moments ago she had regained inner peace, now anxiety returned and tormented her mind even more fiercely. Desperate, she stepped onto the porch, peered through the gap in the door. Inside, everything was arranged as usual, with no signs indicating her daughter had been away for long. She glanced at the neighbors on both sides, who were hundreds of yards away, and slowly walked out of the gate, turned right, and followed the side of the road to the neighboring house to inquire about her daughter. The landlady, a woman of similar age, was outside the yard stacking firewood. She cheerfully approached, nodded, and said, "May I ask you something? I just came from Saigon to visit my daughter, but neither she nor her husband are home. I don't know where they've gone, and they've been away for a while." The woman paused and replied, still working with her hands, "Is your son-in-law Mr. Hock? I saw him this morning. He probably went out briefly and will be back soon." Mrs. Ken nodded and said, "Thank you. If that's the case, then I can wait at ease. I thought they had gone far away, and I would have to return to Saigon." The neighbor woman said, "No, stay here and relax for a while. I'm sure he'll be back soon." Mrs. Ken bowed her head and said, "Yes, thank you. I'll go back to my house and wait for my grandchildren." With those words, She turned towards the gate and pondered a series of questions about Trin's appearance in her recent dream. She stopped for a moment, then turned back to the neighbor woman and asked, "Excuse me, I have another question out of curiosity. But, this morning, did you see Trin, my daughter, or her husband?" The neighbor woman looked puzzled, not understanding why Mrs. Khan asked so insistently. Mrs. Khan put the firewood down and replied, "It seems that Mr. Hock rode his motorbike alone. I remember he was wearing a green cloth hat and was alone. Maybe your daughter went to the market. I heard there's some business going on there." Mrs. Khan stood there, thinking for a while, and asked again, "So, in the past few days, have you noticed anything happening at their house?" The neighbor woman stared at Mrs. Khan, and in surprise, she couldn't comprehend why Mrs. Khan was asking so many detailed questions. Mrs. Khan explained further. "For example, did they have an argument or anything like that?" The woman shook her head. "No, I haven't heard or seen anything." Mrs. Khan hesitated for a moment and asked another crucial question. "Do you remember the last time you saw them, both the couple or just Trin? When was the last time you saw her?" "It doesn't necessarily have to be both of them, I'm only asking about Trin." "Has it been a long time since you last saw her?" The neighbor woman guessed that something troublesome was going on. However, the only troublesome situation she could think of was Trin leaving home, possibly following a man. And today, Mrs. Khan appeared, seeking answers. The neighbor woman dropped the knife, held her hat, wiped her sweat, and replied, "I saw her a couple of days ago, maybe 2 or 3 days. I saw her hanging clothes behind the house." "So, did she leave home?" Mrs. Khan interrupted. 2 or 3 days. Please try to remember if it was 2 or 3 days. The neighbor woman replied, "I'm not quite sure, it seems like it was 3 days. I clearly saw Mr. Hock riding his motorcycle